I'm a burden. That's what my own son called me the night he told me he had sold his father's company without even looking me in the eye. He said it so casually, like he was commenting on the weather or reminding me to turn off the lights before bed. And for a moment, I thought I had misheard him, that maybe grief had distorted his words the way it had distorted everything else in my life these past few weeks. But then he repeated it, slower this time, almost impatient, as if I were the one making things difficult, and I realized he meant every word. The dining room felt too large for just the three of us, the long oak table stretching between us like a silent witness to something breaking that could never be put back together. My husband's chair sat empty at the head of the table, exactly where it had been for over 30 years, and I found myself staring at it instead of at my son, as if somehow his presence might still be there, steady and grounding, the way it had always been when things felt uncertain. It had only been 10 days since we buried him, 10 days since I stood in a black dress under a gray sky and said goodbye to the man who had built everything we had from nothing, including that company Daniel now claimed to have sold. 10 days, and already the life we built together was being dismantled piece by piece, not by strangers, but by the child we raised with everything we had. You should be grateful, Daniel added, leaning back in his chair with a confidence that didn't belong to him. Not really. I made a smart decision. The market's unpredictable right now. It was the right time to sell. I nodded slowly, my hands folded neatly in my lap to keep them from trembling, because trembling would have given him something, some sign that his words had landed the way he intended. Across from him, Vanessa sat perfectly composed, her lips curved into a small, polite smile that never quite reached her eyes, the kind of smile I had come to recognize over the years as something practiced, something calculated. She didn't say anything, but she didn't need to. Her silence had always spoken louder than words, especially when it came to me. I could still remember the first time she walked into this house, all charm and compliments, telling me how lucky Daniel was to have such a devoted mother, how much she admired the life we had built, and I had believed her. I had welcomed her like a daughter. I had trusted her. Now she sat there like she had always belonged in that seat, like the house itself had quietly shifted to make room for her while pushing me further to the edges. Dad left it to me, Daniel continued, finally glancing in my direction, though his eyes slid away almost immediately, unable to hold mine for more than a second. It was my decision to make. That was when I smiled. Not because I agreed with him, and not because I didn't understand what he was trying to do, but because in that moment, something inside me settled into a calm I hadn't felt since before my husband died. It was a quiet kind of clarity, the kind that doesn't come with tears or raised voices, but with the simple understanding that the story you thought you were living in has just changed, and that the people you thought you knew have revealed something they can't take back. I lifted my glass of water, took a small sip, and set it back down carefully, making sure the sound of it touching the table was soft, controlled, deliberate. "If you say so, Daniel," I replied, my voice even, almost gentle, as if we were discussing something ordinary, something that didn't matter at all. He looked relieved, which told me everything I needed to know. He had expected resistance, maybe even a scene, something he could dismiss or use against me later. Instead, I gave him nothing, and that, more than anything, seemed to unsettle Vanessa, whose smile flickered just slightly before she quickly recovered, her eyes narrowing in a way that suggested she was already trying to figure out what I wasn't saying. I lowered my gaze to my plate, untouched food growing cold in front of me, and let the silence stretch just a little longer than it should have. They thought they had already won. They thought this was the end of something. But as I sat there in that quiet, watching them from behind lowered lashes, I realized it was only the beginning, and for the first time since the funeral, I wasn't afraid of what would come next. The house felt different the next morning, not in a dramatic way, but in the kind of quiet shift that settles into the walls when something unspoken has taken root. And as I stood in the kitchen, pouring myself a cup of coffee I did not really want, I noticed how every sound seemed sharper, more deliberate, as if the house itself were paying attention. The clock above the stove ticked steadily, each second stretching longer than it should, and the sunlight coming through the window fell across the counter in the same soft pattern it always had, but it no longer felt comforting. It felt indifferent. I carried my mug to the dining room, stopping just long enough to glance at the chair that had been my husband's, and for a moment, I could almost see him there again, reading the morning paper, his glasses low on his nose, the way he used to when he thought I was not watching. He had always been the one who handled everything when it came to the business, the contracts, the decisions that carried weight, and I had trusted him completely, not because I could not understand those things, but because I knew he would never make a decision without considering what it meant for both of us. That was how we built our life, side by side, even when it did not look that way from the outside. I sat down slowly, wrapping my hands around the mug for warmth, though it had already begun to cool, and let my mind move through the past few months with a kind of clarity that had not been possible before. The changes had been there, small at first, almost easy to dismiss if you were not looking closely enough. Daniel had started speaking differently, not just to me, but about things that used to matter to both of us, using phrases that sounded rehearsed, detached, as if he were repeating something he had been told rather than something he truly believed. Vanessa had become more present in every decision, even the ones that had nothing to do with her, offering suggestions that slowly turned into expectations until it no longer felt like a discussion at all. I remember the day the office keys had been changed, how Daniel had brushed it off as a security update, and the way Vanessa had smiled when she thought I was not paying attention, a small, satisfied expression that lingered just a second too long. At the time, I had told myself it was nothing, that I was imagining patterns where there were none, that grief was making me sensitive to things that would not have bothered me before. But sitting there now, with the quiet pressing in around me, I could see it for what it was, not a single moment of betrayal, but a series of careful steps that had led to this, each one small enough to avoid confrontation, but deliberate enough to change everything. I set the mug down gently and stood, walking toward the study at the end of the hall, the room my husband had spent so many late nights in, going over numbers, reviewing documents, making sure everything was exactly as it should be. The door was slightly ajar, and when I pushed it open, the familiar scent of paper and polished wood greeted me, unchanged, as if time had paused in this one space while everything else moved on without permission. His desk was still exactly as he had left it, files stacked neatly, a pen placed carefully beside a leather folder, and for a moment, I simply stood there, taking it in, letting the stillness settle around me. Then I stepped forward and opened the top drawer, my fingers moving with a certainty that surprised even me, as if some part of me had already known what I would find, or at least where to begin looking. Because if there was one thing I understood now, it was this: my husband had never been careless, and he had never left anything important to chance, especially not when it came to protecting what we had built together. I slid the drawer open slowly, careful not to disturb the order my husband had always kept with such quiet precision, and inside, everything was exactly where it should have been, rows of neatly labeled folders, each one bearing his familiar handwriting, steady and deliberate, the kind of handwriting that came from a man who never rushed decisions and never overlooked details. For a moment, I hesitated, my fingers resting lightly on the edge of a folder marked simply with the company name, as if opening it would confirm something I was not yet ready to fully face, but then I exhaled and lifted it out, placing it on the desk in front of me. The leather felt smooth beneath my hands, worn just enough to show years of use, and when I opened it, the scent of paper and ink rose faintly, grounding me in a way that nothing else had since the funeral. Inside were documents I recognized, contracts, reports, statements, all organized with the same care he had always taken. But beneath those, tucked slightly out of sight, was a sealed envelope, thicker than the rest, its edges crisp, untouched. My name was written across the front in his handwriting, not hurried, not uncertain, but intentional, as if he had taken his time with each letter, knowing exactly when and why I would one day find it. I stared at it for a long moment, my chest tightening in a way that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with understanding that this was not an accident, that whatever was inside had been left for me, specifically for a moment like this. Carefully, I broke the seal and unfolded the papers inside, my eyes moving across the line slowly at first, then with growing focus as the meaning began to settle into place. It was not just a letter, though there were words addressed to me, written in the same calm tone he had always used when he wanted me to trust that everything would be all right. It was something more, a set of instructions accompanied by legal documents that outlined conditions, protections, and contingencies that had never been discussed openly, not because he had wanted to keep secrets from me, but because he had been preparing for something he hoped would never happen. My fingers tightened slightly on the edge of the paper as I read a particular clause again, making sure I had not misunderstood it, but the meaning did not change no matter how many times I looked at it. The company had not been transferred outright, not in the way Daniel believed, and certainly not in the way he had presented it at the dinner table. There were conditions, very specific ones, tied to conduct, to respect, to the way family members treated one another, and more importantly, to the way they treated me. I let out a slow breath, setting the papers down carefully as a strange kind of calm settled over me, deeper and steadier than anything I'd felt the night before. The room seemed quieter now, not empty, but still, as if it were waiting for me to understand what had been placed in my hands. I glanced toward the window, where the light had shifted slightly, casting longer shadows across the desk, and for the first time since Daniel had spoken those words, I felt something shift inside me as well. Not anger, not even sadness, but clarity. Because this was never just about a company, and it was never just about money. It was about control, about respect, about who had the right to decide what happened to everything we had built. And as I gathered the documents back into the folder, smoothing the edges with deliberate care, I realized that Daniel had made one very important mistake. He had assumed I did not know anything. He had assumed I would not look. And most of all, he had assumed that I had nothing left to protect. I closed the folder gently and returned it to the desk, but this time I did not step away. Instead, I stood there for a moment longer, letting the silence settle into something solid, something I could carry with me, because whatever came next, I would not be walking into it unprepared. The paper did not shake in my hands, even though part of me expected it to, expected some visible sign that what I had just read would crack something open inside me. But instead, everything felt strangely steady, as if the ground beneath me had finally stopped shifting and revealed where I actually stood. I moved to the chair behind his desk and sat down slowly, letting my fingers rest against the surface he had worked at for decades, tracing the faint marks left behind by years of decisions, late nights, and quiet determination. He had always been a careful man, not cautious in a fearful way, but deliberate, the kind of person who thought 2 steps ahead without ever making it obvious. And now, sitting there with those documents in front of me, I could see just how far ahead he had been thinking. I remembered the evenings when he would come home later than usual, his tie loosened, his expression thoughtful but calm, telling me there were things he needed to review, details he wanted to get right. And I had never questioned it because I trusted him completely, not just as my husband, but as the man who had always made sure we were protected in ways I did not always see. Back then, it felt like routine, like part of the rhythm of a life we had built together. But now those memories shifted into something else, something more intentional, as if every late night and every quiet moment had been leading to this exact point. I leaned back slightly in the chair, closing my eyes for just a second, and I could almost hear his voice, not in a sentimental way, but in the steady, grounded tone he always used when explaining something important, the way he would pause just long enough to make sure I was following, even when I already understood. He had told me more than once that ownership was never just about names on paper, that real control came from understanding how everything was structured beneath the surface, and at the time, I had smiled and told him that was his world, not mine, that I prefer to keep things simple. He never argued with me about that. He just nodded, like he always did, and continued doing what he believed needed to be done. I opened my eyes and looked down at the documents again, reading through the clauses more carefully this time, noticing the details I'd skimmed over before, the specific language that left very little room for interpretation. There were protections built in, conditions that could not be bypassed simply by signing a paper or making a quick decision. And most importantly, there were consequences tied directly to behavior, to actions that could not be hidden behind polite words or convenient explanations. I thought about Daniel sitting across from me at that table, speaking with a certainty that had not come from experience, but from assumption, and for the first time, I saw it clearly, not just what he had done, but how little he truly understood about what he believed he now controlled. Vanessa, on the other hand, was different. She watched more closely, listened more carefully, and it was her reaction the night before, that brief flicker in her expression when I did not respond the way she expected, that lingered in my mind now. She would notice the change. She would sense that something had shifted, even if she could not yet see what it was. And that meant I needed to be careful, not cautious in the way I had been before, quietly accommodating and overlooking, but deliberate the way my husband had always been. I gathered the papers and placed them back into the envelope, sealing it loosely before returning it to the folder exactly where I had found it, making sure nothing looked disturbed, nothing out of place, because for now, it was important that they believed nothing had changed at all. As I stood and stepped away from the desk, I glanced once more around the room, taking in the stillness, the quiet sense of order that remained untouched by everything unfolding outside of it, and I felt that same steadiness settle deeper within me. They had already decided what role I was supposed to play in this story. They had already assumed how it would end. What they did not realize was that the story they were so confident in was built on something they had never taken the time to truly understand. And now that I did, I was not going to rush what came next. I was going to let them continue exactly as they were, because sometimes the clearest truth does not need to be forced into the light. Sometimes it reveals itself when people believe no one is watching. That afternoon, I moved through the house the same way I always had, quietly, without drawing attention to myself, but this time, every step felt more intentional, as if I were no longer just living in the space, but observing it, noticing things I had once overlooked because I trusted that everything was as it should be. In the kitchen, I wiped down the counter, even though it was already clean, listening carefully to the low hum of voices coming from the living room, where Daniel and Vanessa sat together, their conversation drifting in and out of clarity depending on how close I stood to the doorway. I did not walk in. Instead, I remained just out of sight, my back turned slightly, my movements slow and measured, giving them no reason to lower their voices further. "We need to move quickly," Vanessa said, her tone softer than usual but edged with urgency, the kind she used when she believed she was being practical, not unkind. "If we wait too long, it is going to get complicated." Daniel let out a quiet breath, the sound of it familiar, something I had heard countless times when he was trying to convince himself of something. "It is already done," he replied. "The sale went through. There is nothing left to complicate." There was a pause, long enough to carry weight, and I could almost picture the way Vanessa would be looking at him, not satisfied, not entirely convinced. "That is not what I mean," she said after a moment. "The house, Daniel. We need to think about the house. Maintenance alone is going to be too much, and you know she cannot handle it." She did not say my name. She did not have to. I continued wiping the same spot on the counter, though it no longer needed it, letting the words settle without reacting, without even changing my breathing. "We will figure it out," Daniel said, but there was less certainty in his voice now, less of that easy confidence he had shown at the dinner table. "Maybe we can talk to her about downsizing. Something smaller, more manageable." Vanessa let out a quiet laugh, not loud enough to sound cruel, but sharp enough to carry meaning. "You really think she's going to agree to that?" she asked. "After everything?" Another pause followed, and this one felt different, heavier, as if something unspoken had passed between them. "She does not have much of a choice," Daniel said finally. And there it was again, that tone, not quite his own, shaped by something else, something that had been growing in him for longer than I had wanted to admit. I set the cloth down carefully and reached for a glass, filling it with water even though I was not thirsty, giving myself a reason to remain where I was, to listen without being seen. "We just need to be careful how we handle it," Vanessa continued, her voice lowering slightly. "If she starts asking questions about the company, about the paperwork, it could get messy." "You said everything was transferred cleanly, right?" "Yes," Daniel answered quickly, too quickly. "My name is on everything now." I closed my eyes for just a second, not in frustration, not in disbelief, but in acknowledgement, because in that moment, the last piece settled into place. It was not just assumption. It was certainty built on incomplete understanding, reinforced by convenience, and encouraged by someone who saw opportunity where others might have seen responsibility. I opened my eyes again and took a slow sip of water, letting the coolness ground me before I turned and walked quietly down the hall, my footsteps soft against the floor. They did not notice me. They did not stop talking. And that told me everything I needed to know. Because people only speak that freely when they believe there is nothing left to hide, when they are certain they are already in control. And as I stepped back into the quiet of the study, closing the door gently behind me, I realized just how important that belief would be for what came next. I did not rush into anything after that, because rushing would have meant reacting, and reacting would have meant playing into a version of me they had already decided they understood. So instead, I slowed down, moving through the rest of the day with the same quiet rhythm they had grown used to, letting them believe that nothing had changed at all. At dinner that evening, I set the table the way I always had, placing each dish carefully, aligning the silverware just so, even lighting a small candle in the center, not for atmosphere, but for consistency, because consistency can be more disarming than confrontation. Daniel barely looked up from his phone as he sat down, his attention divided, his posture relaxed in a way that suggested he felt entirely at ease, as though the conversation from the night before had already settled into something finished and resolved. Vanessa, on the other hand, watched me more closely, her eyes following my movements in small, almost imperceptible ways, as if she were trying to detect a change she could not quite name. "You do not have to do all this," she said lightly, gesturing toward the table. "We have just ordered something." I smiled, the same calm expression I had worn the night before, the same one that had unsettled her just enough to make her cautious. "I prefer this," I replied, my voice even, leaving no room for interpretation, and she nodded, though the faint crease between her brows remained. We ate, in relative silence at first, the only sounds the soft clink of utensils and the low hum of the refrigerator in the background, and I let that silence stretch, not uncomfortably, but long enough for them to fill it if they chose to. It was Vanessa who spoke first. "Daniel was telling me earlier that you might want to think about making some changes around here," she said, her tone measured, almost gentle, as if she were presenting a suggestion rather than a plan that had already been discussed in my absence. I set my fork down carefully and looked at her, not directly challenging, but not avoiding her gaze either. "What kind of changes?" I asked. Daniel shifted slightly in his chair, clearing his throat in a way that reminded me of when he was younger and about to say something he knew I would not like. "Nothing major," he said quickly. "Just making things easier for you. The house is a lot to manage, and we were thinking maybe something smaller would be better." I nodded slowly, as if considering the idea for the first time, even though I had already heard the outline of it earlier that day. "And where would I go?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral, curious rather than defensive. Vanessa leaned forward slightly, her hands folding neatly on the table. "There are some very nice communities nearby," she said. "Places where you would have everything taken care of. It will be more comfortable. More convenient," I thought, though I did not say it out loud. I let a small pause settle between us before responding, giving them just enough time to believe I might agree. "That is something to think about," I said finally, and I saw it then, the subtle shift in Daniel's shoulders, the way he relaxed just a fraction, as if a tension he had not fully acknowledged had begun to ease. Vanessa's smile returned, smoother this time, more confident, as if she had just confirmed something important. They thought this was going to be simple. They thought I would move gently in the direction they were guiding me, that I would accept the version of reality they were constructing without question. I picked up my fork again and continued eating, my movement steady, unhurried, giving them nothing to push against, nothing to resist. And in that quiet, measured space, I made a decision that felt less like a reaction and more like a return to something I had almost forgotten. I would not argue. I would not explain. I would not try to convince them of anything at all. I would simply let them continue, exactly as they were, because the more certain they became, the less careful they would be, and the less careful they were, the clearer everything would become, not just for me, but for anyone who needed to see it. The next few days settled into a pattern so ordinary it almost felt rehearsed, as if we were all quietly playing roles that had already been assigned, each of us moving through the house with a careful kind of predictability that left very little room for surprise. I woke early, the way I always had, making coffee before the sun had fully risen, standing by the kitchen window as the light slowly stretched across the yard, watching the familiar shapes of trees and fences come into view, unchanged, steady, reliable in a way that people often were not. Daniel left for work later than he used to, his schedule no longer dictated by early meetings or long hours at the office, and I noticed how easily he had settled into that shift, how naturally he accepted a routine that required less of him, as though the responsibility he once carried had already been set aside without much thought. Vanessa stayed home more often now, her presence filling spaces that had once been quiet, her voice drifting from room to room as she spoke on the phone or moved things around with a quiet sense of ownership that had not been there before. I let it happen. I let her rearrange small details, adjust decorations, suggest changes that seemed minor on the surface, but carried a deeper implication if you chose to look at them closely enough. It was not about the objects themselves. It was about the assumption behind them. One morning, I found a stack of papers on the kitchen counter, neatly aligned, held together with a small silver clip, placed just slightly off-center as if they were meant to be noticed but not immediately questioned. I paused when I saw them, not reaching for them right away, simply observing the way they had been positioned, the quiet intention behind their placement. Vanessa was in the living room, speaking softly in her phone, her tone controlled, her words indistinct but steady, and I could feel the subtle awareness behind her voice, the way she was listening for movement, for any sign that I had seen what she had left out in the open. I walked past the counter without stopping, poured myself a glass of water, and then returned a moment later, this time allowing my gaze to rest on the papers as if I had only just noticed them. "What are these?" I asked, my voice neutral, neither suspicious nor concerned, just curious enough to seem natural. Vanessa appeared in the doorway almost immediately, her expression composed, her smile already in place. "Oh, those are just some preliminary documents," she said, stepping closer, her tone light, reassuring. "Nothing urgent. We were just thinking it might be helpful to start organizing things, making sure everything is in order moving forward." I nodded slowly, letting my fingers rest lightly on the top page without lifting it, as if I were considering whether to look more closely or simply leave it be. "Organizing what exactly?" I asked. Daniel entered then, his timing just a little too precise to be coincidental, his eyes flicking briefly to the papers before settling on me. "It is just about the house," he said quickly. "Nothing complicated, just some options, in case you decide you want to make a change." I glanced at him, then back at the papers, and for a moment, I allowed a small hesitation to show, just enough to reinforce the version of me they were expecting, the one who needed time, who needed guidance, who might be persuaded with the right approach. "I see," I said quietly, withdrawing my hand as if I had already decided not to read further. Vanessa's shoulders relaxed slightly, a subtle release of tension that might have gone unnoticed if I had not been looking for it. "There is no rush," she added smoothly. "We just want to make sure you are taken care of." I smiled then, a soft, measured expression that revealed nothing beyond what they wanted to see, and stepped away from the counter as if the matter were already settled for the moment. But as I walked down the hall, I could feel it clearly now, the way the pieces were being placed, the way the path was being shaped ahead of me, and more importantly, the way they believed I was simply following it without question. They were not hiding anything anymore. Not really. And that was exactly what I needed. By the end of the week, the papers appeared again, this time not on the kitchen counter, but on the dining table, placed neatly where my husband used to review contracts late into the evening, and the change in location was not accidental. It was deliberate, a quiet escalation that suggested they were ready to move from suggestion to expectation. I noticed them the moment I entered the room, even before I turned on the light, because something about the space felt different, as if it had been arranged to guide me toward a decision I had not yet agreed to make. The overhead light cast a soft glow across the surface of the table, and there they were, aligned perfectly, a pen placed beside them at just the right angle, waiting. I did not approach immediately. Instead, I set my purse down by the door, took off my coat, and moved through the familiar motions of returning home, giving them time to anticipate my reaction, to wonder how I would respond this time. When I finally stepped closer, I rested my hand lightly on the back of a chair, not sitting, not committing, just observing. The top page was visible enough to read without lifting it. Phrases carefully printed in clear, professional language, references to property transfer, voluntary relocation, and authorization, words that sounded harmless when read quickly, but carried weight when understood fully. "We thought it might be easier if everything was in one place," Vanessa said from the doorway, her voice smooth, measured, already prepared. I turned slightly, just enough to acknowledge her presence without giving away anything more. "Easier for who?" I asked, my tone calm, almost conversational. She smiled, stepping further into the room, her posture relaxed, her confidence growing with each step. "For you," she replied. "This way, when you are ready, everything is already prepared. No stress, no confusion." Daniel appeared behind her, his presence quieter, but not neutral, his eyes moving between us as if he were trying to maintain balance, though it was clear which side he stood on. "It is just a formality," he added, echoing the same reassurance I had heard before. "Nothing changes until you decide." I looked back at the papers, letting a small silence stretch between us, long enough for them to fill it with their own assumptions, long enough for them to believe I was considering what they wanted me to consider. Then I pulled out the chair and sat down slowly, the movement deliberate, controlled, as if I were stepping into a role they had written for me. I reached for the pen, lifting it just slightly, feeling its weight in my hand, and in that moment, I could feel their attention sharpen, their focus narrowing to this single action. Vanessa leaned forward just a fraction, her breath held in a way she probably did not even realize, while Daniel remained still, waiting. I lowered the pen back onto the table without touching the paper and folded my hands neatly in front of me. "I will need some time to read through this carefully," I said, my voice steady, leaving no room for argument, but also no room for immediate refusal. Vanessa's smile held, though it tightened at the edges, her patience thinning just slightly. "Of course," she said, though her tone suggested she had hoped for something quicker, something easier. "Take all the time you need." I nodded, rising from the chair with the same measured calm, leaving the papers exactly where they were, untouched, unchanged, as if nothing had happened at all. But as I walked away, I understood something clearly now, something they had not yet realized themselves. They were no longer testing the waters. They were already stepping in, confident that the ground beneath them was solid, that everything had been secured in their favor. And that confidence, that quiet certainty, was exactly what would allow them to keep going, to keep pushing, to reveal more than they intended, all while believing they were still in control. That night, I returned to the dining room long after the house had gone quiet, the kind of quiet that settles deeply once everyone believes the day is finished and nothing more will happen. And I stood there for a moment, looking at the papers still waiting in the exact position I had left them, untouched, patient, as if they had all the time in the world. The overhead light cast a soft circle across the table, leaving the rest of the room in shadow. And for a brief second, it reminded me of the nights my husband used to sit here, reviewing documents with that same steady focus, never rushing, never assuming, always reading every line as if it mattered, because to him, it always did. I pulled out the chair slowly and sat down, the wood cool beneath my hands as I reached for the stack, lifting the top page this time, not hesitating, not pretending anymore, at least not when I was alone. The language was polished, carefully constructed to sound reasonable, even considerate, outlining options, suggesting benefits, framing everything as if it were designed for my comfort and convenience. But beneath that surface, the intent was clear, the direction unmistakable. They wanted control, not just of the house, but of the decisions, the timing, the outcome, and they believed the right words, arranged the right way, would make it easy, would make it seem like my choice. I turned the page slowly, reading each section with the same attention my husband would have given it, noting the phrasing, the conditions, the assumptions built into each paragraph. And the more I read, the more certain I became that they had moved forward without understanding the full structure of what they were trying to claim. There were references to ownership that did not align with the documents I'd already seen, timelines that suggested authority they did not fully possess. And most telling of all, there was no acknowledgement of the conditions my husband had put in place, the ones tied not just to the company, but to everything connected to it. I set the papers down carefully and reached into my pocket, pulling out my phone, the screen lighting up softly in the dim room. And for a moment, I simply held it there, considering the next step, not in a hurried way, but with the same deliberate calm that had been building in me since that first conversation at the dinner table. There was a number saved under a name I had not needed to use in years, not because it was unimportant, but because everything had always been in order, handled, secure. I pressed it and waited, listening to the quiet ring on the other end, each second measured, controlled. When the voice finally answered, steady and familiar, I did not explain everything at once. I did not rush into details or emotions. I simply stated what needed to be said, that I had found the documents, that there had been a claim of a sale, that there were additional papers now being presented to me for signature. There was a brief pause on the other end, not long, but enough to carry weight, and then a response, calm, precise, asking me to bring everything in, every document, every detail as soon as possible. I agreed, my voice matching that same steadiness, and ended the call without lingering. I placed the phone back on the table and looked at the papers once more, not with uncertainty, but with clarity, because now there was no question left about what needed to be done next. I gathered the documents neatly, aligning them the way they had been before, and set them back down exactly where I had found them, leaving no sign that anything had changed. Then I stood, pushing the chair in quietly, and turned off the light, letting the room fall back into shadow. Upstairs, I could hear the faint sound of movement, a door closing softly, the ordinary sound of a house settling into the night, and I moved through it just as quietly, carrying with me not anger, not urgency, but something far more controlled, something that did not need to be seen to be effective. Because by morning, nothing on the surface would look any different at all, and that was exactly how it needed to be. The next morning unfolded with the same quiet precision I come to rely on, the kind of routine that keeps everything appearing unchanged even when something beneath the surface has already shifted, and I moved through it carefully, aware of every detail, every glance, every word that passed between us. I dressed as I normally would, choosing the same neutral colors, the same understated pieces that never drew attention. And when I stepped into the kitchen, Vanessa was already there, standing by the counter with a cup of coffee in her hand, her posture relaxed, but her eyes alert, watching in that subtle way she had perfected over time. "You are up early," she said, her tone light, as if it were nothing more than an observation. But there was a question behind it, one she did not voice directly. I smiled faintly and reached for a mug, pouring myself coffee without hesitation. "I have always been an early riser," I replied, keeping my voice steady, giving her nothing to hold on to. Daniel joined us a few minutes later, his movements slower, less deliberate, as if the weight of his decisions had already begun to settle into something he did not fully understand, though he would not admit it. He glanced at me briefly, then at Vanessa, a silent exchange passing between them that felt more practiced than natural. "We were thinking," he began, his voice careful, measured, "maybe today would be a good time to go over those documents together, answer any questions you might have." I took a small sip of my coffee, letting the pause stretch just long enough to make the moment feel considered rather than reactive. "That will not be necessary," I said calmly, setting the mug down with quiet precision. "I already have an appointment this morning." The shift was immediate, though subtle, a tightening in Vanessa's posture, a slight hesitation in Daniel's expression as they both adjusted to something they had not anticipated. "An appointment?" Vanessa asked, her voice still composed, but no longer as smooth as before. With whom? I met her gaze evenly, not challenging, not avoiding, simply present. Someone who can help me review everything properly. I answered, offering no additional details, no explanation beyond what was required. Daniel frowned slightly, the first visible crack in the certainty he had carried so easily before. "Mom, that is not really necessary," he said, his tone softening in a way that might have sounded concerned if I had not already heard the conversation from the day before. "We can go through it together. It is all straightforward." I held his gaze for a moment, just long enough for him to feel it, then looked away as if the matter were already settled. "I prefer to be thorough," I said simply. Vanessa set her cup down carefully, the sound just a fraction sharper than intended, and stepped a little closer, her expression controlled but her eyes searching. "There is nothing complicated about it," she said. "We just want to make sure you are comfortable." I nodded once, acknowledging her words without accepting them. "That is exactly why I will have it reviewed," I replied. The silence that followed was not long, but it carried weight, the kind that shifts the balance of a room without raising a voice. Daniel exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair in a gesture I recognized from years ago, though now it seemed less like uncertainty and more like resistance, meeting something it could not easily move around. "When is your appointment?" he asked finally. "This morning," I answered, reaching for my purse, my movements calm, unhurried, as if this had always been part of the plan. I walked past them without waiting for another question, without offering reassurance or explanation, because neither was necessary anymore. And as I stepped out of the house, the morning air cool and steady against my skin, I realized something had changed in a way that could not be undone. They were no longer guiding the situation. They were reacting to it, and that, more than anything, meant I was exactly where I needed to be. The office building had not changed in all the years I had known it. The same glass doors, the same quiet lobby with its polished floors and soft lighting, everything designed to feel calm, controlled, and professional. And as I stepped inside, I felt that same steadiness settle over me again, the kind that comes from walking into a space where things are handled with clarity rather than assumption. The receptionist looked up and smiled politely, asking my name, and when I gave it, there was a brief flicker of recognition before she nodded and gestured toward the waiting area. "He is expecting you," she said, her tone respectful, measured, as if she already understood that this was not a casual visit. I sat down, placing my purse neatly beside me, my hands resting calmly in my lap as I waited, not anxious, not uncertain, simply present in the moment, letting everything unfold at the pace it needed to. It did not take long before a door opened and a familiar voice called my name, steady and composed, unchanged despite the years that had passed since we last spoke in person. I stood and walked toward him, Mr. Green greeting me with a quiet nod, his expression serious but not surprised, as if what I had described over the phone had already prepared him for what was to come. His office was exactly as I remembered, organized, precise, every file in its place, every detail accounted for. And as I sat across from him, I placed the documents on the desk one by one, not rushing, not skipping anything, allowing him to see the full picture exactly as it had been presented to me. He did not interrupt as he read, his eyes moving steadily across each page, occasionally pausing for just a moment before continuing. And the silence between us was not uncomfortable. It was focused, deliberate, the kind that carries weight without needing explanation. When he finally set the papers down, he folded his hands lightly on the desk and looked at me, not with alarm, not with confusion, but with a clarity that confirmed what I had already begun to understand. "They believe they have more authority than they do," he said evenly, his voice calm, measured, leaving no room for doubt. I nodded once, not in surprise, but in acknowledgement. "That is what it seems," I replied. He leaned back slightly, considering the documents again before continuing. "The company was never transferred outright," he explained. "Your husband structured everything with very specific conditions. Any change in control requires compliance with those conditions, and based on what you have shown me, those conditions have not been met." I felt the words settle into place, not as something new, but as confirmation, something solid, something that could not be dismissed or reinterpreted. And the sale. I asked, my tone steady even. Mr. Green shook his head slightly. Invalid under the current structure, he said. At best, it is premature. At worst, it exposes them to significant legal consequences if pursued further. I let out a slow breath, not in relief, but in clarity, because this was no longer about suspicion or assumption. It was about fact, about what could be proven and what could not. What about the documents they want me to sign? I asked, gesturing lightly toward the stack on his desk. He glanced at them briefly before looking back at me. Those are designed to give them the authority they do not currently have, he said. If you sign them, you would be formalizing a transfer of control that has not yet occurred legally. I held his gaze for a moment, then nodded again, my decision already formed before I had even asked the question. Then I will not be signing anything, I said simply. He gave a small, approving nod, not in agreement, but in recognition that I understood the situation fully. That would be the prudent course of action, he replied. There was a brief pause, and then he added, if you wish, we can arrange a formal meeting. Present everything clearly. Ensure there is no misunderstanding moving forward. I considered that for a moment, not because I was unsure, but because I understood what such a meeting would mean, what it would reveal, and more importantly, what it would take away from those who believe they were already in control. Yes, I said finally, my voice calm, steady. I think that would be appropriate. And as I gathered my things and stood to leave, I realized that whatever came next would not be a confrontation driven by emotion or reaction. It would be something far more precise, something structured, something that would not need to raise its voice to be heard. Because the truth, when placed in the right setting, does not argue. It simply stands. The meeting was set for 2 days later, enough time for everything to appear normal on the surface, enough time for Daniel and Vanessa to settle back into their certainty, and I made sure of that, moving through the house with the same quiet rhythm, answering questions without offering more than necessary, allowing them to believe that whatever hesitation they had seen before had already begun to fade. When I mentioned a meeting, I did so casually, as if it were nothing more than a routine step, a simple review to clear things up, and I watched carefully as the information settled between them. Daniel agreed quickly, almost too quickly, his relief evident in the way his shoulders eased, as if he believed this would confirm everything he had already decided. Vanessa, however, did not respond right away. She studied me for a moment, her eyes narrowing just slightly, searching for something beneath the surface, something that did not quite align with her expectations. That sounds reasonable, she said finally, her voice smooth, but not as effortless as before. The morning of the meeting arrived without urgency, the kind of quiet start that gives no indication of what is about to unfold, and I dressed the same way I always had, choosing simplicity over statement, allowing nothing about my appearance to suggest anything out of the ordinary. Daniel drove us, his hands steady on the wheel, though he spoke less than usual, filling the silence with occasional comments about traffic or timing, small distractions that did not quite mask the tension building beneath them. Vanessa sat beside him, her posture composed, her expression carefully neutral, but I noticed the way her fingers moved slightly in her lap, a subtle rhythm that betrayed a level of awareness she could not fully conceal. When we arrived, Mr. Green greeted us with the same calm professionalism he had shown me before, his demeanor unchanged, his tone measured, and he led us into the conference room without unnecessary conversation, allowing the setting itself to establish the weight of the moment. The room was simple, a large table, neatly arranged chairs, a folder placed at each seat, and as we sat down, I noticed how Daniel reached for his folder immediately, flipping it open with quiet confidence, while Vanessa paused for just a second longer, her gaze moving from the papers to Mr. Green, as if reassessing something she had previously taken for granted. Mr. Green began without delay, his voice steady, precise, outlining the structure of the company, the conditions attached to its ownership, the legal framework that governed any transfer of control, and as he spoke, the atmosphere in the room shifted, not dramatically, but unmistakably. Daniel's expression changed first, the confidence softening into something less certain as the details unfolded, each explanation pulling him further away from the version of reality he had been holding on to. "I do not understand," he said finally, his voice tighter than before. "My name is on the documents. The sale was processed." Mr. Green nodded slightly, not dismissing him, but clarifying. "Your name appears on preliminary filings," he said. "However, those filings do not override the conditions established by your father. Without meeting those conditions, the transfer is incomplete, and any sale based on that assumption is not valid." The words settled heavily, not loud, not aggressive, but firm in a way that could not be easily challenged. Vanessa leaned forward slightly, her composure still intact, but her eyes sharper now, more focused. "And what conditions would those be?" she asked. Mr. Green turned a page in the folder before him and continued, his tone unchanged. "Respect and non-displacement clauses," he said. "Specifically, the protection of Mrs. Collins' residence and authority. Any attempt to remove or diminish her position without her explicit consent voids the transfer entirely." The silence that followed was different from any that had come before. Not uncertain, but definitive, as if something that had been assumed was now being clearly removed. Daniel looked at me then, really looked at me for the first time since this had begun, and in his eyes, I saw it, not understanding, not yet, but the beginning of it, the realization that the situation was not what he had believed it to be. I met his gaze calmly, not with anger, not with accusation, but with the same steady clarity I had carried with me from the moment I first opened that envelope, because this was never about proving him wrong. It was about letting the truth stand where it could no longer be ignored. No one spoke immediately after that, not because there was nothing left to say, but because everything that needed to be understood had already been placed clearly on the table. And for the first time since this had begun, the silence did not belong to me. Daniel looked down at the documents again, flipping through the pages more slowly now, as if reading them a second time might somehow change what they said, his earlier confidence replaced by a quiet tension he could not fully hide. Vanessa remained still beside him, her posture composed, but her expression had shifted, the certainty that once defined her now replaced by something more calculated, as if she were already searching for a way to reposition herself within a situation that no longer favored her. Mr. Green allowed the moment to settle, his presence steady, his role fulfilled without the need to press further, because the facts did not require emphasis, they simply existed, clear and immovable. I sat quietly, my hands resting lightly in front of me, not waiting for an apology, not expecting acknowledgement, because this was never about hearing the right words. It was about seeing the truth recognized, even if only in silence. "So what happens now?" Daniel asked finally, his voice lower, less certain than I had ever heard it before, and for a brief moment I saw something familiar in him, not the man he had become in recent weeks, but the son I had raised, uncertain, looking for direction. Mr. Green answered calmly, his tone unchanged. "That depends on how you choose to proceed," he said. "As it stands, no transfer has occurred, and no sale is valid. Any further action would require full compliance with the original conditions, including Mrs. Collins' explicit consent." Daniel nodded slowly, though it was clear he was still processing what that meant, still trying to reconcile the difference between what he believed and what was now in front of him. Vanessa spoke next, her voice measured, careful, as if each word were being chosen with greater precision than before. "And if those conditions are not met?" she asked. Mr. Green met her gaze evenly. "Then nothing changes," he replied. "The current structure remains in place." There was no threat in his voice, no judgment, just a simple statement of fact, and that was enough. I stood then, not abruptly, not to make a statement, but because there was nothing left for me to sit through, no further explanation required. Daniel looked up at me, his expression uncertain, searching, as if expecting something more, some reaction that would tell him how to move forward. I met his gaze calmly, holding it for just a moment before speaking, my voice steady, clear, carrying none of the weight he might have expected. "You did not sell anything," I said quietly. "You only assumed you could." The words settled between us, not harsh, not raised, but firm in a way that left no room for misunderstanding. Vanessa's eyes flickered slightly, her composure holding, but just barely, as the reality of the situation fully settled in. I gathered my things without haste, my movements the same as they had been all along, measured, controlled, unaffected by the shift that had just taken place. As I turned toward the door, I paused for a brief moment, not to look back, but to let the silence complete what had already been said. Then I walked out, my steps steady, my posture unchanged, leaving them where they were, not defeated, not destroyed, but confronted with something they could no longer ignore. Outside, the air felt clear, the kind of clarity that does not come from winning or losing, but from understanding exactly where you stand and no longer needing to prove it to anyone else. And as I walked toward the car, I realized that nothing had been taken from me, not my home, not my place, not the life I had built alongside the man who had understood long before. I did exactly what would need to be protected. The only thing that had changed was the illusion they had been holding on to, and once that was gone, there was nothing left for me to carry but the quiet certainty that I had never been the burden they claimed I was.